The Pacific sky was a mirror of flame and silence. Far below, the sea shimmered with the reflection of a dying sun. A lone American B-17 bomber limped through the clouds, 2 engines coughing black smoke, its fuselage torn open by machine gun fire. Inside, the crew barely moved, some bleeding, some praying, all certain that death would find them before land did. Out of the horizon, a silver shape appeared, slicing through the light. A Mitsubishi A6M0, the feared Japanese fighter that had ruled the Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. Its pilot had already shot down dozens of enemies. His name was Saburo Sakai, an ace of the Imperial Japanese Navy, disciplined, precise, and trained to kill without hesitation. He lined up his sights, the bomber framed perfectly against the sea. The gunners inside were too injured to fight back. Through the shattered glass of his canopy, Sakai could see them moving. One slumped over his gun, another bandaging a wound with trembling hands. He could almost hear their struggle through the silence of altitude. His thumb rested on the trigger. A single burst would finish them. The war demanded it. His orders demanded it. But in that instant, something wavered. The bomber wasn't fighting anymore. It was falling apart, limping home, carrying men who were already ghosts. The crosshairs drifted from the cockpit window to the wounded men inside. Sakai thought of the family photo tucked inside his flight suit, the one he looked at before every mission. He thought of his own crewmen, friends who had burned in the air. He saw, not enemies, but men who had done the same things he had, taken off with hope, fought for survival, prayed for home. The Zero's guns stayed silent. He banked his aircraft gently to the left, pulling alongside the bomber. The 2 planes flew together for a brief, impossible moment, predator and prey suspended in the same sky. The Americans stared through cracked windows, stunned that he hadn't fired. One of them raised his hand weakly, not in surrender, but in disbelief. Sakai dipped his wings in return, a pilot's salute. Then he rolled the Zero away, sunlight flashing across its insignia, and vanished back into the clouds. The American crew would later report that the Japanese fighter had appeared, taken aim, and instead of firing, had simply watched them limp home. Some believed they had imagined it. Others called it divine mercy. But for the rest of their lives, none of them forgot. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this story, you'll understand why one of Japan's most feared aces became the man remembered for mercy in the middle of madness. Below, the B-17's pilot pushed the throttles forward, every vibration threatening to tear the plane apart. The bomber crawled toward the horizon, its crew staring out at the empty sky where death had turned away. No one spoke. No one could explain it. Up above, Sakai flew home in silence. He should have reported the kill, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. The sky around him was calm, but inside the cockpit, his thoughts were not. He had been raised to see compassion as weakness, mercy as betrayal. Yet the act of not killing had given him something he hadn't felt since the war began: peace. That single moment would follow him through every mission that came after, through every memory of the friends he lost, through the ruin of his country. The man who had been trained to fight without mercy had discovered something far more dangerous: his own conscience. He was born in 1916 in the rural prefecture of Saga on the island of Kyushu, a land of rice paddies, fishing boats, and the scent of the sea. His family was poor but proud, descended from samurai who had once served a local lord. From the moment he could walk, Saburo Sakai was taught the code of Bushido: loyalty, honor, obedience, and above all, endurance. His father died when he was 11, leaving the family adrift. The young Sakai grew restless, drawn to the idea of flight he'd read about in newspapers, and by 16 he enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was the path of discipline and prestige, but it came at a price. Training at the Naval Academy was brutal. Recruits were beaten for the smallest mistake, forced to scrub floors until their hands bled, and taught that hesitation was shameful. Instructors hammered one lesson into every young man: your life belongs to the Emperor. To break was to dishonor not just oneself, but one's ancestors. Compassion was weakness. Doubt was treason. Years later, Sakai would write in his memoir, "They beat the weakness out of us until nothing remained but duty." Yet even then, something in him resisted the total surrender of self. He studied his superiors, learning not just their commands, but their tempers. He learned how to survive the system, to endure, to appear obedient, and to keep a quiet world inside himself where no officer could reach. When he earned his pilot's wings, it was as if the world opened. He described his first solo flight as leaving the Earth for another life. In the cockpit, he felt freedom that the rigid hierarchy of the Navy could never contain. But that freedom came chained to war. By 1941, Japan's empire stretched across Asia, and its leaders promised victory as destiny. Pilots were told they carried the divine wind, the kamikaze spirit of their ancestors. The enemy was not human. He was an obstacle to be erased. Sakai absorbed it like every young man of his generation. The belief that sacrifice was purity, that survival meant shame. Yet he carried small rebellions within him. Before each mission, he would take out a photograph of his mother and bow his head. He called it his personal pre-flight ritual, not to ask for victory, but to remember life beyond the war. In those seconds, the future ace of the Imperial Navy was still a son. When Pearl Harbor ignited the Pacific, Sakai was already flying patrols from Formosa. The sky became his battlefield, and his education in mercy turned to steel. He fought in the Philippines, in Java, in the Coral Sea, each victory adding to his legend. He was fast, methodical, unnervingly calm. American pilots began to recognize his markings and speak his name with dread. The Empire celebrated him as a hero, proof of the warrior ideal. His comrades called him the Sky Samurai. Yet behind the salute and the smile, there was still a trace of that quiet boy from Saga, the one who watched clouds and wondered what it meant to fly. The war had made him a weapon, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the indoctrination and the code, something human remained, waiting for the moment when the world would force him to choose between obedience and conscience. The early war years turned the sky into his domain. By 1942, Saburo Sakai had become one of Japan's most feared fighter pilots, credited with dozens of victories across the Pacific. He flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, light, fast, and unmatched in the first months of the conflict. Allied crews came to dread its distinctive engine whine, a sound that usually meant death was seconds away. Sakai's skill wasn't just aggression. He was patient, surgical. He never fired unless his sights were locked and the distance perfect. He would shadow his enemy, study his flight pattern, wait for the fatal mistake, and strike. His superiors called him disciplined. His rivals called him merciless. Yet even then, he refused to celebrate his kills. Each one, he later said, was another son who would not go home. Through 1941 and early 1942, he fought over the Philippines, Java, and the Coral Sea. The Imperial Navy's aces were treated as living weapons, paraded through radio broadcasts, photographed beside their planes, hailed as proof of Japan's divine mission. For Sakai, each victory only deepened the contradiction between his pride and his unease. Before every mission, he still looked at the small photograph of his mother tucked into his flight suit and whispered, "Watch me return." He earned medals, promotions, and the respect of men who lived by the same unbending code. In combat, he was unstoppable. In quiet moments, he was haunted. The stories from the front, of prisoners executed, of villages burned, began to reach even the most loyal pilots. Yet no one spoke of such things. The code of Bushido left no room for questions. By mid-1942, the tide had begun to shift. Japan's once unbeatable air arm was being pushed back, island by island. Guadalcanal became the center of the storm, a strip of jungle and coral that both sides bled to control. The skies above it became a crucible for pilots. Missions ran daily, sometimes 3 or 4 sorties in a single afternoon. The heat warped the air, engines overheated, and exhaustion turned even aces into targets. Sakai flew those missions relentlessly. On August 7, 1942, he led a formation of Zeros to intercept a group of U.S. bombers near Tulagi. The sky filled with fire. He shot down one, then another, but tracer rounds ripped across his canopy. Bullets tore through his face, one blinding him instantly in the right eye. Shards of glass embedded in his cheek. Blood filled his mouth. His plane spiraled downward. Any other pilot would have bailed out. Sakai refused. Half conscious, half blind, he clawed the Zero back under control. For the next 4 hours, he flew 600 miles back to his base at Rabaul, one hand gripping the stick, the other pressed to his ruined face to stem the bleeding. He drifted in and out of awareness, guided only by memory and instinct. When he finally landed, the ground crews were too shocked to move. He had brought back a plane that should have fallen into the sea. Doctors told him he would never fly again. He ignored them. Months of surgeries followed, the right side of his face rebuilt with scars that never healed. He was alive, but changed. The experience stripped away the illusion of invincibility. In the cockpit, he had seen the thin line between life and death, between victory and loss, and for the first time, he began to question what it meant to fight. The Empire called him a hero for surviving. Sakai called it something else. "When you face death for hours," he wrote later, "you stop believing in glory." Months later, against all odds, Saburo Sakai was back in the cockpit. The surgeons said his depth perception was gone, that he could never fight again, but he begged to return to duty. Flying was his life, the only thing that gave meaning to the pain. His right eye was blind, his vision uneven, yet his instincts remained perfect. He learned to compensate, to judge distance not by sight, but by sound, by feel, by the subtle vibration of the plane beneath his hands. By early 1943, he was flying patrols once more from the base at Rabaul. The war had changed. Japan was now on the defensive, its air superiority slipping away. The skies that once belonged to the Zero were filling with American bombers. B-17, B-24, heavy, slow-moving giants that swallowed the horizon. Each mission became a desperate attempt to hold ground that was already lost. It was during one of those patrols that the moment came. Sakai had climbed to intercept a formation of enemy aircraft crossing the Solomon Sea. The sun burned above the clouds, the sea below reflecting light like a blade. He spotted one straggler far behind the rest, an American plane, trailing smoke, its right engine dead. It was alone, crippled, limping toward safety. He rolled his Zero into position. His training kicked in automatically, Gain altitude, drop behind, close distance. He leveled his sights on the bomber's tail. Inside the shattered fuselage, he could see the chaos. The tail gun gone, the turret silent, the crew moving slowly through the wreckage. The men were alive but broken. They weren't even trying to defend themselves anymore. Sakai's finger rested on the trigger. His orders were clear. No mercy. The enemy was to be destroyed wherever found. But as he drew closer, something in the scene stopped him. Through the glass, he saw the faces of the men, young, terrified, covered in blood and oil. One helped another strap into a seat. Another clutched a bandage to his neck. They were not enemies now. They were survivors, clinging to the same thin hope he had known when he himself crawled back from death. He could have ended them in seconds. Instead, he eased back on the throttle. The Zero drifted alongside the bomber, the two machines hanging together in the still air. The American gunners looked up, expecting death. Instead, they saw the Japanese pilot lower his nose and salute. A small, deliberate gesture, the acknowledgement of life where war demanded none. Then he pulled away. The Zero rolled over the bomber's wing, dipped once in a final gesture, and vanished into the blue. The B-17 staggered on toward the coast, leaking smoke but alive. When it landed, the crew could only describe what they had seen as impossible. The enemy who came to kill them, and instead let them live. Sakai said nothing about it to his superiors. Mercy was not something the Imperial Navy recorded. He flew back to base in silence, the wind howling through the bullet holes in his canopy. That night, alone in his bunk, he replayed the moment again and again. The faces, the hesitation, the peace that followed. He didn't understand it fully then, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time, he had chosen disobedience, and found it was the only decision that made sense. The Zero came home with a different weight that night, metallic, private, impossible to file into a report. Word on the flight line moved in whispers. Sakai had hesitated. He had let a crippled bomber live. Some called it mercy. Others, in the clipped language of a fighting service, called it weakness. The rumor folded itself into the routine of the squadron. Missions, debriefs, engine checks, until it was just one more thing nobody talked about aloud. In the months that followed, the reaction around him was small and sharp. Fellow pilots nudged aside if they saw him staring at his hands. A lieutenant who had once laughed with him in the mess began to keep his distance. Command never officially punished Sakai. There was no report, no court-martial, because there had been no confirmed radio transmission, no signed confession. But in a service built on obedience and ritual, silence can be a sentence as loud as any reprimand. He felt it in crowded rooms. He felt it when men who had sung together over cheap tea no longer asked about his family photo. Sakai's comrades, some who had ridden with him through victories and losses, tilted their heads toward the same code that had trained them to kill. Mercy was a hole in the armor. To show it was to risk everything. They did not speak of his act, but their eyes kept tallying him in a ledger he could not read. That quiet ostracism would have been easier to bear if not for the rest of the war. The Pacific tightened like a noose. Guadalcanal burned. Rabaul smoked. The Imperial Navy's doctrine grew sterner as defeats mounted. Propaganda turned from bold promise to bitter urgency. When the military began forming kamikaze units, pilots whose last mission would be their own death, Sakai received orders that would test his silence to its limit. He was to train, to prepare, to lead men into ritualized sacrifice. The state wanted warriors who would not flinch, The code demanded it. Sakai refused. Not with a public speech, he would never do that, but with the stubborn private logic that had guided him above the sea. Fighting should be an act of skill and survival, not a theatrical refusal to live. A pilot's duty is to fight, he would later write, not to waste life meaninglessly. In doing so, he broke a different kind of discipline, one that equated surrender of self with devotion. For many in his chain of command, refusal was tantamount to treason. For him, it was survival and, audibly, sanity. His refusal did not bring immediate redemption. It brought missions. He kept flying, kept leading sorties, earning the same cold respect that follows a man who does his job though his soul protests. In the cockpit, he still performed with the ritual precision that had once made him an ace. He checked his gauges, lined his sights, and took to the air as if the old code still fit. Between missions, he wrestled with the memory of the bomber, the faces in the torn fuselage, the weak salute, that impossible moment when the world did not demand blood. Back at base, he began to write. Not the propaganda dispatches commanders wanted, but notes, small observations, the names of streets he wanted to walk down again, phrases of a life he could not reconcile with killing. Over time, those notes became the skeleton of a memoir, an act that would later astonish both enemies and allies because it recorded not feats of violence, but the inner logic of mercy. In Samurai, he would later admit that sparing a crew had cost him among peers, but gained him something else, self-possession. He had, in his words, saved my humanity. Not everyone understood this as moral courage. To some of his contemporaries, the act was a lapse they could not forgive. To younger pilots, already plucked up by fanaticism and fear, it was proof that the old rules still held. Victory at any price. Sakai did not write those men off. He watched them, taught them what he could about flying and survival, and tried, where possible, to hold a quiet argument that skill and life were not mutually exclusive. The argument was mostly private, offered in the form of advice on gunnery or on how to nurse a wounded engine home. The war's end did not wash away the small controversies. In post-war Japan, narratives split between celebration of sacrifice and uneasy guilt. Sakai's story found its way into both. For some, his refusal to fire that day marked him as an anomaly, an ace who had the decency to remember the enemy's humanity. For others, it was complicated, inconvenient, a detail that did not fit neatly into a country's need to remember itself as brave. He lived for a long time between those memories, neither fully condemned nor fully celebrated. Still, the act planted seeds. Years later, American veterans would tell the story of the Japanese fighter that escorted them away rather than down. They would speak of the salute, the stunned silence, and the sense that even in a world driven to annihilation, one human had chosen another human's life. When Sakai met some of those survivors decades later, gray, tentative, alive, they would clasp each other's hands. The gesture was small, but it closed the circle that began over the blue of the Pacific sky. For Sakai, the most striking cost was interior, a life reframed by a single decision. He continued to fly, to fight, to survive, and later to write and teach. He was never certain he had done the right thing in anyone's absolute terms. He only knew the answer that had been given to him in the cockpit that day. Killing had a price his soul could not pay. That quiet refusal, unreported, unlauded at the time, would later become the thing he was most remembered for. In the end, the backlash that followed him through the war lost its bite to the longer story of human memory. What began as suspicion hardened into respect, as more men who'd known him watched him survive and, eventually, seek reconciliation. The pilot who had hesitated in the sky did not become a pariah. He became a witness to a different way of being a warrior, one who refused to let killing erase compassion. Japan's surrender in August 1945 marked not just the end of a war, but the collapse of everything Saburo Sakai had once believed unshakable. The empire was gone. The code of Bushido that had shaped his youth now looked like a shadow on the ruins. Tokyo was ash and silence, its streets lined with gaunt survivors picking through what remained of an empire that had promised eternity. Sakai returned home with one good eye and the weight of 1,000 memories. His medals meant nothing. The young recruits who once saluted him were dead, the hangars empty, the Zero squadrons erased by time. He had flown to serve the emperor, but the emperor had spoken on the radio and called the war a mistake. For the first time, obedience no longer had meaning. He found work wherever he could. The pilot who had once cut through the clouds of Guadalcanal now typed forms in an office for barely enough to eat. Japan's new rulers had forbidden all veterans from owning weapons or wearing uniforms. The country that had worshipped soldiers now tried to forget them. In that silence, Sakai began to rebuild himself. He turned inward, toward Buddhism. He sought simplicity and discipline again, but without the violence. The rituals of meditation replaced those of the flight line. The endless noise of combat gave way to an understanding that survival itself could be a kind of redemption. By the early 1950s, former American pilots began to return to Japan as visitors. Some came in curiosity, some in reconciliation. Sakai met them not as enemies, but as equals who had lived through the same madness. He bowed to them. He spoke softly about endurance, not victory. To the surprise of many, there was no bitterness in him, only a determination that the hatred he'd been raised on would not outlive him. He began to write his memories down. The result was Samurai, a book that stripped away myth and offered honesty instead. He admitted to killing, to pride, to fear. He also wrote about the day he refused to fire, the moment when a single act of mercy taught him what all the fighting had failed to. Western readers called it grace. Japanese readers called it shame. But in time, that book traveled further than his aircraft ever had. He later opened a small business, visited schools, and lectured young pilots. His message was not patriotic, but human. He told them that skill was meaningless without restraint, that the hardest thing a warrior could do was to stop himself. In the 1970s, an American journalist arranged a meeting between Sakai and surviving members of that crippled bomber crew. They met in a hangar, gray-haired men with shaking hands. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then the old gunner stepped forward and told him, "We thought we were dead. Then we saw you wave." Sakai bowed and replied, "I am glad you lived." The room was quiet, but for the sound of distant aircraft outside. Not war machines, but passenger planes, rising and fading into the sky. He spent his final years in peace, visiting temples, teaching, smiling easily. When he died in 2000 at the age of 84, veterans from both sides sent flowers. His gravestone bore no rank, no tally of victories. Only words he had once spoken to a student pilot: to kill without hate, to fight without cruelty. And so, the man who had once been the sharp edge of an empire became its quiet conscience. In a world that taught men to obey without question, Saburo Sakai proved that even at 30,000 feet, surrounded by smoke and fire, a single heartbeat of mercy could survive. After the war, Japan's cities grew from ashes, but the minds of its veterans remained in ruins. Saburo Sakai, one of the few surviving aces of the Imperial Navy, lived through that contradiction daily. The same country that once worshipped men like him now avoided their eyes. His victories were no longer celebrated. They were reminders of what Japan had lost. The faces that had cheered him into the air in 1942 now looked away when they passed him on the street. He moved through the quiet with the precision of an old habit, disciplined, reserved, never self-pitying. The rituals of flight became the rituals of peace, rising at dawn, cleaning, writing, bowing before a small altar. He spent his mornings repairing things, small machines or household tools, as if restoring order to a broken world. He never again took up arms. In time, he began to speak publicly, not as a soldier seeking redemption, but as a man searching for understanding. He traveled to schools and community halls, often invited by teachers who had grown up during the occupation and wanted their students to hear from someone who had seen war up close. Sakai told them what it meant to be trained to kill and what it meant to choose not to. He described his act of mercy not as heroism, but as awakening, a moment when the line between friend and enemy dissolved into something simply human. The students listened in silence. Some saw a relic of a past they had been taught to forget. Others saw the embodiment of a virtue they had never been allowed to name. He told them that a pilot's greatest weapon was not the aircraft, but his judgment. That courage meant knowing when not to fire. His words were simple, but they cut through the myths that still lingered about glorious death and eternal honor. Sakai's life became a quiet campaign for memory. He urged reconciliation between Japan and the countries it had once fought, not through politics, but through shared grief. He attended ceremonies beside American, Australian, and British veterans, men who had once been his targets. He bowed to their dead, and they bowed to his. The gestures were small, but for those who had survived the same skies, they carried a truth no treaty could. When he was invited to the United States, he visited air museums where his old enemy's planes hung above him in polished silence. He stared at the same aircraft he once tried to destroy. The B-17S, the Wildcats, the Hellcats, now gleaming like ghosts under fluorescent light. In one of those museums, he was reunited with a crewman from the bomber he had spared decades before. The man embraced him. Both were old now. Both carried eyes that had seen too much. The cameras captured it. Two former enemies bound by the rarest of wartime memories, mercy. For once, there was no propaganda, no medals, no flags. Only a handshake that bridged what nations had torn apart. By the 1990s, Sakai was often called the gentle ace. Younger journalists sought him out for interviews. They expected bravado. What they found was reflection. He spoke softly of those he had lost, of the futility of blind obedience, of how belief without compassion can turn any country into a graveyard. He told one interviewer, "The sky taught me the greatest lesson, that all men fall the same way." He lived long enough to see Japan's post-war generations grow distant from the world he had known. When he passed away in 2000, he was remembered less as a warrior and more as a teacher. His funeral drew pilots from every side of the Pacific War, Japanese, American, Australian, men who once fought to kill one another, now standing shoulder to shoulder. In the end, his legacy was not his 64 victories, nor his record-breaking flight home after being shot through the head. It was the single moment he refused to pull the trigger. The mercy he showed over the Pacific rippled through the decades, carried in every story told by those who survived because of it. And as the jets roared over his funeral in salute, their sound faded into something softer. the same wind that once whispered through the cockpit of a Zero. For Saburo Sakai, it was never about the war he fought, but the peace he found by sparing life when all the world told him not to. The years that followed turned him into something rare, a symbol both sides could agree upon. To the Japanese, he became proof that honor didn't vanish with defeat. It evolved. To the Americans, he was living evidence that even in the bloodiest war of the century, humanity had not died. His story traveled through classrooms, documentaries, and veterans gatherings, often introduced not with his rank or kill count, but with a single sentence: he was the man who spared his enemies. Sakai never sought fame. He preferred silence, the kind that reminded him of cruising above the Pacific when the world below was still asleep. But when invited to speak, he carried himself with the same calm focus he once reserved for combat. His voice remained steady, never dramatic. He described killing without hate, surviving without pride, and living without resentment. He told audiences that he was no hero. He had simply done what any man should have done when confronted with suffering. When asked if he regretted fighting for Japan, he always paused before answering. "Regret is not the right word," he would say. "Understanding is." It was not a denial. It was acceptance, that he had been shaped by a nation that taught obedience above compassion, and that the true victory lay in unlearning it. By the late 1980s, he had become a fixture in peace events across Asia. He stood beside men who had once bombed his homeland, each of them older, slower, yet still haunted by the same images of burning skies. They spoke not as victors or victims, but as witnesses to what war does to the soul. Sakai's presence gave those gatherings gravity. When he spoke, he did so not as a moralist, but as someone who had stared at death so long that he could no longer hate it, only respect its cost. He often visited schools for pilots, reminding cadets that courage was not measured by how many lives they took, but by how many they spared. Some dismissed him as sentimental. Others listened with the stillness reserved for confession. He taught them that a true warrior must first master his own fear, because fear was what made men obey blindly. In his home near Tokyo, visitors often found him tending a small garden. He said the soil reminded him of the sky, both endless, both humbling. When he watered his plants, he sometimes looked upward, as if searching for the contrails of the past. He lived simply, surrounded by photographs, the Zero he had flown, the comrades he had buried, and one faded picture sent from America, the crew he had spared. They had written on the back, "To the man who let us live." When age finally took him, it did so quietly. There was no ceremony, no state funeral, only a gathering of those who understood what he had stood for. His grave overlooked the sea where he had first learned to fly. The inscription was brief: "To kill without hate, to fight without cruelty." The wind at his funeral carried the sound of distant waves, soft and constant, like an engine idling far away. Those who knew his story said it felt like he was still flying, somewhere beyond sight, where the sky holds both enemies and friends without distinction. And as the world continued to tell its stories of victory and vengeance, Saburo Sakai's name remained a quieter one, a reminder that amid all the noise of war, one man once chose silence, and in that silence found peace. The final years of his life unfolded like the calm after a storm that had raged too long. The man who once flew at the heart of war now moved through days measured by sunrise and the soft rhythm of his breath. Saburo Sakai's home was modest: a single floor, paper walls, a garden no larger than a patch of wing. Visitors remembered the scent of incense and the steady quiet that seemed to surround him like a second skin. He spoke often of flight, but rarely of combat. What he loved, he said, was the feeling of being suspended between worlds, where the earth seemed distant and the sky infinite. In that place, he once told a student pilot, you understand that life is small, but it is everything. Old comrades would visit, some broken by time, some still carrying the pride they could never let go of. They would drink tea and remember those who never came back. When talk turned to the men he spared, Sakai's expression changed. He didn't call it forgiveness or pity. He called it recognition. That in another sky, it could have been him inside that bomber. He had no illusions about what he had done during the war. He had killed. He had obeyed. He had believed. But in the years that followed, he spent his life trying to balance the scale in ways words could not. He funded scholarships for young pilots. He donated to peace memorials. He sat in silence beside American veterans and listened as they told their own stories of fear and mercy. Each time, his response was the same, a slow nod, as if to say he had already heard it, somewhere above the clouds long ago. When asked what he wanted to be remembered for, he smiled. The same patient smile that had unnerved interviewers who expected a hardened warrior. "Remember me," he said, "as someone who learned." On September 22, 2000, Saburo Sakai died peacefully in Tokyo after attending a reunion of old naval aviators. He had shaken hands, laughed quietly, and signed photographs. A few hours later, he was gone. It was almost poetic. A final descent after one last gathering of those who had once ruled the sky. At his funeral, there were no speeches about victories, only silence and the sound of waves beyond the cemetery wall. A single Zero, restored and airworthy, flew overhead and dipped its wings, a gesture of respect not to a killer, but to a man who had remembered his humanity when the world had forgotten its own. As the plane vanished into the horizon, the mourners looked toward the sea. The light shimmered across the water the same way it had when Sakai had saluted that wounded bomber 58 years earlier. Somewhere, above all that distance, mercy still traveled. And so ended the story of Saburo Sakai, the warrior who fought for an empire, lost an eye to a bullet, and found vision in compassion. His life became proof that even in the most violent of times, conscience can survive the code, and mercy can outlive war. When the guns of the Pacific fell silent, few stories endured with the same quiet power as his. Saburo Sakai's name faded from the headlines long before his legacy took root, not through the roar of engines, but through the whisper of memory. Every pilot who later heard his story, every historian who studied his record, came to the same realization, that compassion shown once can echo across generations louder than any victory. Decades after his death, new pilots, both Japanese and American, would read Samurai as part of their studies. Some focused on tactics, others on endurance, but for many, the part that lingered was only a paragraph long, the moment when he spared his enemies. The story became legend, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. It told of a man who refused to become what war wanted him to be. Museums began to display his photograph beside those of his rivals, the Americans he once fought against. There he was, not in uniform, not in triumph, but in peace, half smiling, eyes steady, hands folded. The caption beneath it was short. He chose mercy. Veterans who visited often paused there longer than they did at the medals or the maps. They recognized something truer than strategy, the realization that bravery is not measured by how you kill, but by how you stop. Even in Japan, where memory of the war still stirred uneasy debate, Sakai's image softened what history had hardened. The young saw him as proof that duty and morality need not collide. The old saw in him a chance to believe that redemption was possible without denial. To both, he was the same, the pilot who found peace at gunpoint. Those who flew with him remembered his calm voice before takeoff. He would remind them to breathe, to focus, to trust their instincts. That same composure carried him through the decades that followed, through defeat, poverty, and rebirth, until the very end. And so his story remains, not carved into stone or shouted in ceremony, but carried in the minds of those who understand that war, in the end, is not about enemies. It is about choices. Saburo Sakai's choice was simple. Faced with dying men in a crippled plane, he chose mercy over obedience. That single act, made in a sky filled with death, survived every empire, every ideology, every reason the war had ever given. He fought for his country, but lived for something greater, the courage to see humanity where the world demanded hate. And for that, the pilot who once soared over the burning Pacific will forever be remembered not for how many he downed, but for the ones he let fly home.